For years, the idea of the future has been shaped by societal and governmental decisions of the present. When we imagine the future, we pinpoint all the negatives and positives that go along with the current state of society. As a result, try to shape the future primarily around the positives we believe are essential for future survival. Not necessarily the survival of future generations, but the survival of the current generation in the future, should we so happen to live into it. In the show Altered Carbon, we have ensured that possibility and diminished the distinction between the living, the dead, and the unborn, as believed by Fritsch. Due to the transferability of the human consciousness from one body to another, the dead could become the present and subsequently the future. The living could transform into immortals, turning into representatives of the future, and therefore making decisions based on what will be beneficial to future generations, the unborn. And finally, the unborn could become the past or the present, but why not the future, as they were meant to be? In this scene, Lawrence has thrown an exclusively met party. Looking closely, you can notice the distinction in clothing between the two classes. The grounders are draped in the most simplistic, or I'd say common clothing, compared to the Met, who are adorned in robes similar to those belonging to Roman noble houses. The exotic dressing signifies power and influence in the protectorate. In this party, the rich are to bring significant objects that are important to them. Notice when Clarissa presents her object, she is standing on elevated ground over the few commoners that are present in the party, in order to show her dominance. When Clarissa displays her unique object, you think it's a common snake, but as you keep watching, you realize it's a person stacked inside a snake sleeve rather than a human sleeve. And her reason? Because they can. Because no one controls them but themselves. And they answer to no one and represent no one but themselves. When Lawrence displays his object, he claims ownership of Kovacs. And why exactly does he present Kovacs as his object? To display his power and influence on being able to own an unborn. Notice the camera angle. While he's presenting, he's looking down at Kovacs. And when the camera angle switches to Kovacs' point of view, Kovacs is looking up, signifying the difference in status. Flashback to the scene when Kovacs is being brought back from the dead. He walks through a group of newly sleeved criminals and victims of criminal acts. All of a sudden, the attention switches from him to the complaints of some parents who just received their 7-year-old in the body of an old lady. After voicing their concerns, the camera switches to the security guard, who is supposed to represent the law and protect. However, he seems to not care about the situation of the family. Similar to this scene is the scene at the hospital, where upon bringing in a near-dead Ortega, the nurse who is supposed to help people looks extremely unconcerned, with no care whether she lives or dies. However, when Kovacs' DNA traces his credit line, it portrays the credit of that belonging to a man. The nurse's body language immediately switches from unperturbed to panic and sudden distress for Ortega's life. Another act of mental representation of themselves is that involving a lieutenant, who with the look of despair and hopelessness has succumbed to the idea that they are worthless and lack any type of freedom and will. But what can really be done when the so-called representatives only protect and provide for themselves, turning institutions that were to protect the common interests of the new generation into weapons through which they exact their will and dominance over the unborn? Even in the environmental setup of Bay City, there is a clear distinction between the Met and the new generation, and that is the clouds. Portrayed in this scene, the clouds lay dominion over everything, leaving only a tiny hole in the sky where sunlight leaks through. Signifying to a new generation, there is only one way to move up in the world, and that is to be at their mercy. Or unless you mow your way through, which is difficult, as portrayed by the flying car that carries Kovacs to Suntouch House, which basically has to exact an enormous amount of force in order to break through the clouds and reach the atrium where the representatives call home. As visibly shown, they have lost touch with the new generation and are not witness to the environmental damage present on the ground. where once roads and bridges have now become container dwellings belonging to the new generation. Which poses another question: how exactly can you represent if you lack access to those whom you're representing? Perhaps it wasn't an injustice to begin with, because with the lack of political representation for future generations, the unborn had a chance to create a better world and environment compared to the toxic atmosphere that makes it difficult to differentiate between night and day.